I'd first like to say that I'm a lapsed academic, so that my first response to any problem that I see is to sit down and incessantly research it until my eyes start bleeding from too much reading and too much staring. And social media is actually a problem that I've been actually worrying about for a very long time. Since before I started my PhD, the social side of ebooks and interactive media has always been a key concern, because it seems like that is where the sort of heart of the web and the internet belongs. It's the first thing that happened when we launched this thing was that people started to group into communities. But because I'm concerned, I'd like to warn you in advance that ahead of us is a bit of a Jeremiad. I'm worried, I'm a bit concerned, so the tone might not be entirely hippy-drippy and positive, but I promise that I'm also going to sort of present ideas for solutions and approaches. So, if you sort of steel yourself to go through the go through the hard bits first, we should survive towards the end. But basically, the issue with social media and online social networks specifically is that it's getting very complicated, and especially the way that authors and publishers are interacting with readers and vice versa, and the increasing symmetry that's often between authors and readers, like demonstrated by Wattpad. It's getting very, very complicated. But this is, anybody who looks at social networks sees that this is an awesome research. This is making communities addressable through digitally. And that's sort of, so it's very understandable that businesses want to come in and try and leverage that to make money. But the problem is that if they do this without understanding what's going on there, what they actually do is that they pillage the community. They poison the well, and they basically commit what's a true act of piracy. It can be a destructive act that results in the community disbanding and moving somewhere else online. So to sort of work with these communities sustainably, you have to understand how they work. And that basically means that you need to engage in research, you need to engage in study, and that comes to one problem, which is the fact that the publishing industry has a chronic aversion to facts, research, and statistics. Now, this is an exaggeration. Whenever I come to a conference like this, I meet several publishers that are doing amazing things. They engage with their customers, they do a lot of research in discovering exactly what their customers need, and they do innovative things to try them to make new products and make the most out of digital. But source books like Dominic was talking earlier is one such example, and Safari is another. That they really do good work. So this is an overstatement, but not that much of an overstatement, unfortunately. It's not a question of being conservative. I'm all in favour of small c conservatism, as in that changes to a system that is already working should be proven before you start tinkering with something that is actually working. But the problem that I encounter whenever I start talking to, especially generic trade publishers, is that they do not want their beliefs neither confirmed or denied. They are afraid of the possibility of being wrong. So they'd rather sit back and engage in magical thinking and just sort of hope that their fervent belief how energetically they believe in those ideas will turn them into fact. But that, unfortunately, it just doesn't work. And it's sort of, publishing doesn't exist in a vacuum. That you need to understand what's happening around you, because it's changing a lot faster than it has any time before. Just listening to the presentations yesterday and today means that sort of the only way to tackle that pace of change is research, is trying to understand and having structured methods to investigate the world around you. So with that in mind, I'm going to sort of go ahead on to the what I think is the core problem. And the core problem is that most of the time when you talk to talk to publishers, they think that their approaches to social media and social networking is basically the idea that shouting in public is a good way of selling books. They have this sort of an odd idea that Twitter and the amount of followers you have on Twitter or on Facebook or on any of these platforms is like direct sort of authoritarian capital, that it's a direct measurement of the power you have to sell books. But reality is completely different from that. There is no relation to that. If you look through the studies and research as to how these dynamics play out, there's no direct correlation between how many followers somebody has on Twitter and what his actual social influence is. It can play out in so many different ways from person to person. So the question is, what do we actually know? That's sort of the big ask, as they say. And there's one concept that I've always found very useful, and it's been around since the 70s, which is one point I wanted to make, is the fact that the publishing industry isn't really researched. If you go through academia, there's very little research into the publishing industry and how it works, while social media and electronic media specifically has been been a locus of an incredible amount of research for the past 50 years. You have mathematicians looking at statistics, economists studying the gift economy. You have ethnographers, you have anthropologists, you have psychologists, and there's an incredible wealth of actual hard research available there that's useful, and a lot of it is really old. Like the Allen curve is a simple observation that Thomas J. Allen made in the 70s, and his research has confirmed it again and again and again, right into the modern era of Twitter and Facebook. And it's a simple idea that the further people are apart physically, the less they communicate, even over social media. The basic idea is that the people the 99% of people who are on Twitter or Facebook or any of these social networks, the further apart, the further away geographically the person that they're connected to there is, the less frequently they talk to them. So these social networks, they reflect existing geographically based communities, and it's only in a minority of cases that they create new geographically independent communities. 9 times out of 10, we're talking about tools that reflect communities that exist in real life, and even sort of to a person like me, that I consider myself to be sort of a citizen of Europe. I lived all over the place and know people from all over the place. When I sort of last looked at sort of the Allen curve, and I figured, okay, it might apply to 99% of the people, everybody except me. Surely I'm different. But when I looked through my Twitter use and Facebook and the social networks I use, and looked at the people who I talk to, guess where they all live? They live in the south of England and Iceland, the two places which I spend most of my time geographically. I might connect to other people, but the frequency of engagement is much less the further they are. And it's just a reflection of how our minds are working. The second thing is we actually do know quite a bit about how money and marketing works in social media. The problem is that we do know, what we know is that we know about so many things that don't work. And sort of it's the classic sort of scientific approach of coming up with a theory and disproving it conclusively, but not actually, we haven't actually edged our way into figuring out exactly how things work. And that's probably because networks are, how sort of ideas spread through networks is a very emergent phenomenon, so it's probably impossible to predict. But here's one observation by a person people might know, Seth Godin. It's kind of the guru, the sort of messiah guru of marketing. And it's basically what he says here. Last month, I posted excerpts from my new book. I also wrote a glowing post about Gar's new book on presentations. Guess what? My stats show that I sold more copies of Gar's book than mine. And this is the point, is that people don't trust self-promotion. So I don't know about you, but I've been in on several meetings or discussions where publishers are talking about the platform of the author, where they talk and they look at how many Twitter followers do they have, what sort of presence do they have on Facebook, how many people read their blog. And the problem there is that people don't trust what an author that pimps their own book. And this was written in 2008. This was a known fact to marketing people in 2008, that's 6 years ago. What's more important in terms of marketing is not how many followers the author has on Twitter, it's how many followers his followers have. If he has 100 followers, but each of his 100 followers have thousands, and they're willing to retweet him, that is much more of a marketing impact than his actual follower count. If you just focus on his number, as meaningless as it is, you have no sense of his actual platform and his actual influence. Another sort of known fact that this has been proven in study after study, research after research, and that's a point that people don't really. People don't trust Seth Godin when he's pimping his own book. People slightly trust more when a friend of his pimps another friend's book. But what people really trust is when their own friends and family recommend something, especially when it costs them money. So the idea that you market things by picking out central influences and that sort of magically spreads out from them like a viral contagion, it doesn't really work. Well, the only way to capture the imagination of a large amount of people is actually make something really good and really interesting. And that's the only way to actually guarantee a spread. Here's another one. I don't know how many of you have sort of been unfortunate subjects of reading Malcolm Gladwell's books. But one of his book, The Tipping Point, where he spends several hundred pages misrepresenting every single piece of research on marketing we've ever put together, he talks about the idea of influencers, and influencers being a huge part of making sure that the spread of a product goes to this tipping point where it starts explosively growing. And the problem is that if you actually, this is a recurring problem with Malcolm Gladwell's books, if you actually go to his bibliography and read the research he refers to, the research says something completely different from what he says. He's basically sort of misrepresents or selectively quotes everything that it does. And the point here, the research he referred to in terms of influences is research done by a man named Duncan Watts, who actually wrote a later book, which is much better, which you can sort of look at. And the point that Duncan Watts says, the influences do exist, and they are important sort of nodes in the social network, but they're kind of more of an academic concept because they generally only have 3 times more connections than their friends. So it's like if you have 50 followers on Twitter and your friend has 150 followers, he's an influencer, but he's never going to be a marketing powerhouse or a juggernaut of promoting book sales. And here's a thing that sort of has surfaced from a lot of the work that we've been doing, and also the work that I've been hearing from other people, is that there is a huge difference in effectiveness of marketing towards specialized social networks like Goodreads or Wattpad over going for marketing books to the more generalized social networks like Twitter or Facebook. It seems logical, but it sort of obviously isn't, considering how much time people spend obsessing about how to pitch their book and nag their followers on Twitter into buying their stuff. And there's another point I want to make, and this logical fallacy is something that tends to creep up over and over again in discussions about social media or any sort of research in publishing. And basically, it's like, if you look at, for example, Stephen Fry's Twitter account, he has a massive amount of followers and he sells a massive amount of books. So obviously, he sells books because he has a massive amount of followers. But that is basically wet pavements, looking at outside and seeing that the pavement's wet and it's raining and deciding that wet pavements cause it to rain. You're reversing the cause and effect. The reason why he's popular on Twitter is because he's a celebrity. He's done TV series and sells a massive amount of books. It's the other way around. So, and this is one of the things that a mistake that keeps getting repeated again and again in blogs and discussions, and you see consultants posting their very important observations on why they should be hired to save your company, and they make this mistake about 3 times in the introduction to the blog post, which is always fun. That's one of the reasons why I need to sit in my hands when I read the blog post to prevent myself from saying something angry and stupid in the comments thread. But there are other problems with, there is actually a fundamental problem with focusing too much on social media as a marketing venue. And that is the fact that it is by tying yourself too much to social media by making demands that all of your authors tie themselves into social media and require that as a platform from them, you're basically encoding discrimination into your platform and processes, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with with Kathy Sierra, who's really a fantastic editor and technical writer of technical books. I won't go into the history of what happened exactly, but several years ago she was basically hounded off the internet, and a large part of the reason why that happened was because she was female. And the interesting thing happened though is that she basically wiped her internet presence completely for several years, but the sales of her books went up. They increased, despite not engaging in the essential and vital practice that everybody says you have to do, which is constantly pimp yourself online. Despite not doing that, sales of her went up, and we're not talking about slight sort of uptake, but it has been going up substantially on a regular basis. And this continues to be an issue. Like the other day, there was a slight brouhaha in the sci-fi community about Jonathan Ross presenting the Hugos. He's basically a crass comedian, and people got worried about having a crass comedian present to what was supposed to be a distinguished event. What do you? My perspective is that what else do you expect from awards? But it was interesting to see that you could see 2 sci-fi writers both criticize this decision with almost exactly the same words. One writer got only slight sort of feedback, some of it rude, but nothing that you could couldn't really deal with. You go like, idiot, and just block that comment. The other writer, making almost exactly the same critique, was hounded, got death threats, threats of violence. Their addresses dug up and posted online. The only difference between those 2 authors is that one's female. And it's if we put too much weight into if we require authors to participate in social media, what we are doing then is we were de facto excluding minorities from being authors, because we're demanding of them that they either put themselves at risk or not publish. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down to, but I'm not sure how to actually solve it. Here's another concept which is crops up all the time if you read through the research. And it's the idea that if you, in the old days, like for example when my great-grandfather was a writer, he could participate in politics because the political arena were all, went to meetings, and it was a separate public sphere. And he was a poet, so he went to poetry readings and authored poetry and published poetry, and that was a separate public sphere. And he was an academic. And these separate contexts were independent enough to allow him to pursue these 3 things at the same time. But the problem is, once you put these contexts online, they collapse. And whenever you have to want to participate in one sphere, you have to navigate the issues of the other spheres. So you have an issue where an author makes comments that would have been fine in his local religious community, but or expose him as a bigot and has a massive detrimental effect on the sales of his book online, because he couldn't figure out that if he's going to have bigoted views, he has to keep them offline. He can't actually depend on the independence of the various public spheres to segregate your various voices and ideas. So these contexts collapse, and it makes navigating through them a very, very complicated. And a classic example of context collapse is what's happening on Goodreads, when authors are picking fights with readers and reviewers who are daring to not like their book and saying so in public. And because the authors think of this as publishing something, publishing a review or a rant against them as an attack, because they are thinking about this in the context of the author-reviewer relationship that takes place in sort of more traditional media. The reader is thinking about this in the context of a reading group, of telling their friends about which books they didn't like. So these two contexts have collapsed and are causing conflicts between readers and writers. And there is a partial solution here. And again, this comes from research that dates back to the 70s and 80s. This one was a description by Irving Goffman of how we actually manage to function in cities, because cities are places where you take an absolute mess of a boatload of people and cram them into a tiny space, and the only way that people can actually survive there is by ignoring each other. People basically have to get into the habit of building sort of artificial contexts and separating things out. So civil inattention. The Goffman's classic example was that if you two people alone in a subway car, they ignore each other. That's civil inattention. It would be rude to start engaging with a stranger on the subway. And the same thing if you're on Twitter and somebody starts typing nasty thing about your novel, don't engage them. That's a completely separate context in public sphere. Unless they're talking to you directly, it's none of your business. Even though it might detrimentally affect your marketing, it's still none of your business, because engaging in that would backfire. A contest collapse where two communities start sort of waging war spirals out of control. It has much more detrimental effect than the slight sort of downtick in your sales that comes from having one person being annoyed by how you presented that character in that book. So that's a partial solution, but it takes discipline and it takes practice. And here we come to the point that sort of is the reason why I'm sort of worried about this topic. And if you read through what people advise out there, it's sort of the emotional blackmail, the manipulation of readers, of figuring out ways of how to bully a reader into retracting their review, or the frankly despicable advice that people make about how to write persuasive blog posts about sort of using basically the same tactics as used car salesmen to try and trick people into doing something they don't want to do. And this is despicable. This is nasty. It's like, what's going through people's mind if they're doing this? Just you need to be able to perform the mirror test, in the morning, if I do this, will I still be a person that I want to look in the mirror every morning? And also, this ties into what I said at the beginning, in that this is not sustainable. This is pillaging. Whenever you follow the advice of doing something creepy or doing something manipulative online in terms of marketing, you are eroding that community. And it's just the same as it's just as destructive as open pit mining is. It completely destroys the landscape. So here we come to the actual fun part after the whole sort of bit of complaining and my Jeremiad. What to do? And surprise, surprise, being a sort of a lapsed academic, my first advice is to actually read the research. There's a lot of it, but thankfully, just this week, a book was published called It's Complicated by Dana Boyd. And she is, frankly, this book is the most important book on social media that has been published in the last 5 years, in my opinion. She's been researching teenagers and the use that teenagers the way teenagers use social media and social networking since around 2004. And she's been doing intensive research, a lot of interviews and detailed studies, and she uses that research as a lens to both to study the teenage life in America today, but also to introduce and discuss the various concepts that academics and researchers are using to analyze and study these social networks. So this is both a very important book in that it's a snapshot of how where we're heading in terms of what the teenagers are doing, but it's also a very important book because it uses sort of teenage use of the medium as a lens for us to get familiar with how to think about social media and social networking in general. And especially because a lot of the practices that teenagers do percolate outwards, up to others. I mean, I didn't know until I read her research that it was the teenagers that invented the concept of subtweeting, which, you know, it's probably meaningless to you unless you are an avid Twitter user. But you know, teenagers, some of the practices percolate outwards because they're the first, most fervent users. So recommendation number one. Start off by buying this. Here's the most important part. Because Dana Boyd is a researcher and she passionately believes that the subject is important, she convinced the publishers to let her post this book for free on her site at that URL as a PDF. So you have no excuse. You can actually literally just go there now and download it and read it. And you could read it on the plane like I did, because it just came out this week. Obviously, if you really like it, they'd like you to buy it. But you know, it's really a really good starting point for understanding what actually is happening. And also, once you're done with the book, if you want to get into your true sort of academic style, go through the bibliography and start hunting down those research papers, because a lot of them are really fun as well. But I might be brain damaged from having spent too much years as an academic. Which comes to point number two. This is actually not as scary as people think. I'm not talking about doing massive, expensive studies that involve thousands. You can just start by taking the advice from this book. So this is sort of action point number two. This is a book that it's focused on design research. So the idea, the focus of the book is doing the research that prepares you to design a product. And that it's basically, the idea is that you shouldn't design a product unless you've done some research so that you know who you're doing things for. And it has practical advice. It talks about the set of methodologies. It introduces, walks you through doing things both cheaply and sort of gravitating towards doing things more expensive. And it's a nice handbook for doing sort of qualitative research. It doesn't have to be super scientific, but just doing any research will give you a much better handle on what is actually happening among your customers than reading any amount of blog posts or reading any amount of sort of consultant verbiage that tends to fill the internet these days. The third solution that I propose is actually the most difficult, but strangely enough, it's the first one people try. This is actually really, really difficult to do because you can't tell the difference between a charlatan and somebody who actually knows what they do unless you've actually studied the research yourself. I mean, unless you familiarize yourself with the field enough to understand what's going on, you can't tell apart the con artist who's just spewing some catchphrases and buzzwords and an actual knowledgeable practitioner. So this is actually more work because it means you have to do the work that is involved in the other steps first before you're competent enough to actually hire somebody that knows what they do. Because you can't sort of rely on the sort of referrals from friends. Because I know people who I'm hiring consultants and they say, oh yeah, it was great, but did you actually do anything you suggested? No. Was the stuff you suggested, did it make any sense? No. But it was still great. It's like, what? So this is difficult, but if you've got an absolute shitload of money, well, it's just a nice thing. It's what Microsoft does, for example. The reason why Dana Boyd managed to has the resources to write the book that she did and release it for free is because Microsoft thought that this was important enough just to hire a bunch of researchers and pay them to do research. But most of us don't have the resources of a giant multi-billion-dollar software conglomerate. So even though would be nice for the people that I know who work in this field and would very much appreciate getting paid to do the work. It's actually the most difficult part. So try the other ones first, because it's actually easy to sit down and spend a few evenings to read and sort of get familiar with the situation. So and that's it.